Thank you, everyone. Well, I'm always delighted to see any examples of historical dress. And I love surprises, except that the idea of doing it in front of a judge, jury, audience, and camera is slightly daunting. I'm racking my brain to figure out at what point I said yes to all of this. But I guess it's too late now. Except, of course, if I were to start swearing in court, would I be held in contempt? I'd be held in contempt and thrown out, wouldn't I?
Certainly not, no. No chance.
Okay, so first of all, I think it's worth thinking about how dress survives and why perhaps Exhibit A shouldn't either exist, either it shouldn't exist, or it would definitely not be Tudor. And this is what I'm going to explain to you. Right, it's made of expensive materials, so relentlessly recycled, and it's made of biodegradable materials. And clothing is this sort of weird consumable somewhere between food, which you consume very quickly, and as we did lunch, and say something like furniture, which could last for several generations, centuries. Obviously, it's subject to wear and tear. But if we were all to think about all the clothing that we have worn throughout our lifetime, and where is it now? Did you keep it all? No, you didn't, because you didn't have enough cupboards. So we start to think about the circumstances under which we do collect and save clothing. And particularly so, I think any period before the 19th century, when clothing began to get less expensive because the fabrics were machine woven and they were cheaper. Certainly before that time, clothing was always recycled. It may have gone out of fashion, but those fabrics, those materials were still worth something, and the garment, accessory, whatever it could be reused and repurposed. So obviously something like an object that's been embroidered with precious metal threads or freshwater pearls or gems, completely strip those off and melt it down with a fabric that's been woven with silver or silver gilt thread. You burn it to recover those precious metals. And then, and when I'm talking about the elite here, and I'll come on to our typical non-elite tailors, Tudors in a moment. But even the elite, if we think about Henry VIII, and I don't know whether Maria is going to tell us about his wardrobe accounts, but those of you who've read them, just, like miles and miles of very expensive velvet. And obviously he was getting new clothes all the time. But that clothing was being handed on to members of the court, members of his family, within an elite aristocratic household. These garments would be made over into children's clothing. And of course, the children's clothing would be handed on. It would be given to servants. We've already seen this portrait today, and we might make the suggestion that her gown was perhaps secondhand, had been worn by her mistress. It was one of the perks of domestic servants that you got your master or mistress's cast-off clothing. if it was too grand for you to wear, it was inappropriate for you to wear something that grand, you would sell it to the secondhand clothes dealer and then buy something for yourself. Or if perhaps it was one of their informal garments, you might wear it as your Sunday best. And so for much of the population of England Britain in the 16th century, they were wearing secondhand clothing. It was the equivalent of sort of we have ready to wear now. They had secondhand clothing. And garments would be not just secondhand, third hand, fourth hand, fifth hand, slowly getting more and more bedraggled and moving its way down to perhaps the most destitute in society. And here's a bit of, this is an 18th century image, because we don't really have a 16th century one. One of the things that perhaps we're missing in the pictorial record for the 16th century is a kind of genre scene that might show you. This is sort of Raglan. This is an 18th century second-hand clothing market where there's just piles and piles and it's strung up. And you go and find a piece that you can afford and that isn't into decrepit condition and might just possibly fit. But after you've done that, you could certainly perhaps take it to a tailor, have it altered, have it mended, you know, maybe put some pewter buttons on it that make it look a little bit fancier than what you had. And there was a whole process and a whole industry of securing and recycling this clothing. And I'm showing you Marcellus Laroon's Cries of London from 1688, I think it is. And these are hawkers. They go around and they buy bits of clothing from you. So the young woman here, old satin, old taffeta, or velvet. She's going around getting silk fabrics, like any old scrap will do, because, you know, even if it's a gown falling apart, they will find the bits of silk there that can be remade into shoes, into a purse. You know, we know that hats in the Tudor era, they were often lined with velvet. You might get a scrap of velvet from somebody's old gown that wasn't too bedraggled and line your cap with it. Old cloaks, suits, or coats. There's a man going around and buying old clothing. So even if you can't really be bothered, I was going to say arse, but I don't know to do that. To get yourself down to the second, the person buying it, they'll come round your door. And they make it really easy and give you money. They make it really easy for you to recycle your old clothing. I think what's become clear so far about the clothing of the typical Tudor is that it's primarily wool and linen, both of which were recycled. Linens, the paper industry. As soon as William Caxton sets up that printing press, what was it, 1477 or something? There is this, and then there's this publishing boom in the 16th century, and they just cannot get enough paper because it's all made from linen and cotton. There's a little bit of cotton. Old linen and cotton rags. So when your old shirts and old smocks and your table linen and your bed linen is just so bedraggled and stained and completely unusable again, even for cleaning rags, you sell it to the rag man who takes it off, sells it to the paper maker. So there was never enough and particularly the white linens that people were wearing, the bleached linen, because they couldn't bleach the pulp. If you wanted white paper for printing or writing on, you had to have white rags. And that went right back to the very initial preparation for these very fine wearing linens and table linens and bed linens, as well as the continual laundering process that they all went through. Yes, you could recycle sails and old rope and make it into paper, but it was brown paper, which had lots of uses, but not for writing or printing on. And, well, wool, first of all, it's got to survive the moth, the things that eat wool. Also, there was, another use for woolen rags, which I was fascinated to discover. Now, again, these quotes are 18th century, simply because maybe it took that long for an anorak like Arthur Young, who's obsessed with soil and fertilizer, to actually write it down. It would be interesting to go back, and I don't know whether anything is written or published about these farming principles back in the 16th century, but it wouldn't be unusual for it to be the same practice. So, woolen rags are a manure commonly used around London. So when that doublet and hose and jerkin and gown and kirtle are just so ragged, you can't get any wearing out of them at all, then they're shredded and used as a form of fertilizer. And one can assume that particularly the woolens of the typical Tudor who was doing physical labor, well, there would have been a lot of salt from the sweat in those. And the quote I left out, I should have put it in, was about the cost of this. He's saying they're pretty expensive. It's like, I don't know how many shillings per hundredweight. So somebody's making money out of this, selling the farmer, the rag collector is buying it from, everyday people, buying it perhaps from the secondhand clothes dealer. So there are lots of reasons why all of this would have been recycled and not kept. And in fact, after looking at practices of collecting and what survives over the period of my career at the V&A, I've come to the conclusion that it's benign neglect. Historical dress only survives through bad housekeeping. So, because all those linens, that nice little embroidered bag which you have to sit and unpick all the, okay, I'll do that later, I haven't got time, just put it in the trunk. That's a lovely gown, I've got nothing to recycle it into now, put it in the trunk. And then it gets forgotten about. It might even have to be that you've forgotten you had a trunk. And certainly there's an example of that, the Isham collection that we acquired in 1900 was literally, they found a trunk in this attic above the kitchen at Lamport Hall. Oh, there's a trunk here, and oh, look, it's got all sorts of historical dress. But it has to be forgotten about for 2 or 3 centuries. Otherwise, it just gets recycled into cushions or clothing for the children. And what's particularly interesting from my observations is that 1600 seems to be a sort of cutoff date. There are a number of garments and accessories in our collection, in the other collections at Fashion Museum at Bath, Platt Hall, you think of the Met. there's quite a bit from the 17th century, although there's a big gap in the civil wars, but we have very little in our collection that dates before 1600. And what seems to, you see, there's lots of archaeological finds. In other words, they get either, buried. Alex gave us a wonderful example, a very unusual, remarkable example of the Mary Rose, where and half the ship survives. The other half just got worn away. We have some examples, our knitted caps, which were an archaeological find, except that, we don't like stuff that comes out of the ground, it's all sort of dirty, not very pretty. So we never really repeated that experiment. Or they come out of sarcophagi. If you think of Eleanor of Toledo's gown in Florence. There's also some examples of what they call image robes, so that's fashionable 16th century clothing that was adapted to dress a statue of a saint or, most likely a statue of the Virgin, used in religious processions. Of course, we weren't allowed to do that here in the 16th century. So any examples we have in this country because we bought them from dealers who secured them in Europe. I'm very intrigued to know what this is all about. And of course, for our typical Tudor, and you saw some examples from Pat's presentation of people who were really, really poor. They only have the clothing that they're wearing. They've got one trunk. Where is it going to be saved? Like Tanya was talking about these portraits, they actually have to be associated with a house, a place, an attic for it to go and be forgotten about, which of course our typical Tudor didn't have, and the minute something was worn out and absolutely had to be replaced, it was mended, and finally that didn't work, it went to the ragman. So and that's one of the reasons why working dress of all periods is extremely rare. In a sense, it's more valuable than all the fancy posh stuff that we have. So, okay, bring it on. Very small box.
Dr. North, before you open the box, please can I ask you to confirm that you have never seen the object inside this box?
I have no idea what's inside this box. Well, I'm going to have to get it outside the box. First of all, there's always a question, gloves or no gloves. And it really depends on what you're doing. Obviously, the sense of touch is very important for identifying textiles, saying, we want to make sure something was silk and not polyester. On the other hand, we do know, if I was handling one of those embroidered, very densely embroidered metal, silver gilt sweet bags, that protecting your hands, means that you're not contributing to the tarnishing of the garments. So Right. I'm going to put some gloves on just so I can stretch it out here. So when you know all you're going to need to do is handle, just like move an object, then look, they're the same color.
Judicial views.
It's a windsong.
So one of the first things you would try to determine is what is it made of? So what materials? And thinking about the fiber. So I always think of, 5 fingers on one hand, so it's the fiber, the structure of the material. So fiber, basically in the 16th century, it's going to be wool, silk, cotton, linen, or hemp. Makes it really easy. And then you want to think about the structure, which would be predominantly weaving, but we also have structures like knitting and felt as well. You want to think about decoration. How is it decorated? The color, and whether there's any finishing to the fabric surface. So that might be something like fulling in broadcloth, or glazing with a cotton or linen, or say a worsted. Decoration would be a woven pattern or a printed pattern or an embroidered pattern. And with this, we haven't got a lot to go on, have we? There's no decoration. It looks and feels to me like linen, but it could actually be hemp. And the only way you could tell that would be with looking at it under a microscope. So I would have to, if I were doing this in normal circumstances, I would have to rely on one of my colleagues in conservation to tell me whether, or, it could be cotton. It's unlikely, I think. It could be fustian, which is a mixture of cotton and linen. There isn't a huge amount of cotton yet in Britain because, of course, we haven't got the East India Company, who start really bringing cottons in during the 17th century. But we do have evidence. They call it calico. They don't call it cotton because that's actually a type of wool. And I won't get into the complications of that.
Wasn't there a sumptuary law against cotton?
Not at this point.
At this point, I thought it was under Elizabeth first.
No. It starts in, a variation of 1700 and then 1720 to 1772. It's in the 18th century. So as I say, there is some cotton, but it has to come all overland from India. So it is, in fact, quite expensive. So we'll say it's linen, and it is woven, absolutely. We probably can't show you a magnification of that. It's a plain weave, so we're not looking at a pile weave like velvet or a damask or hang on. Not a twill, is it? No, it's a plain weave. So, it's very clearly a bleached linen, but it's not been dyed, so the color doesn't, so we've got no decoration, we've got no color, it's not been finished, it's not been glazed, there are other examples in which you get a lot more information out of just the textile. So, the next step going on from the textile is you identify it. It's also, if we're looking into thinking in terms of materials, it's clearly been reinforced with something to give it this shape. And because that's completely enclosed in the garment, it's quite difficult to say what that is. One can guess, but and this is where, if it were falling apart a bit more, it would be very helpful, because I would be able to see. You know, I always say with collections, you know, we need at least 3 of everything. No, I think actually I would say 5, but you know, at least 1 or 2 in perfect condition, which you can display. 1 in completely falling apart, so that those who are interested in construction can see all the parts of it they need to see to understand its construction. You know, a couple you can put aside in a storeroom, so that those who want to see inside a garment can actually study it. So perhaps if I had more time, I could I wonder if you can see that. I'm trying to look at a very, you know, there's an exposed end right there. And again, if you could X-ray this, then the texture of whatever is reinforcing this could tell you something. This is around about the period, again, it could be either, are we really into the whalebone era yet? Certainly in the 17th century, 18th century, they're using a lot of whalebone to reinforce clothing. But they have to discover, they have to develop a whaling industry. And they have to discover the properties of baleen and what it can do. And this is what's happening during the 16th century. So is it possibly, you know, a really new and unusual use of whalebone? It's not very thin, it's actually quite thick. It could be reed. That would be the other alternative. which was sort of the standard stiffening material for the 16th century. But it seems to be one solid piece rather than, there are examples of bodices that are disintegrating where you see they're bunches of reeds. This doesn't quite feel like a bunch to me. So anyway, okay, materials, let's move on. So then you start to look at it at the level of a whole. And again, there's 5 things that you're looking for. And this really has to do if you're looking at a kind of whole garment or an ensemble, which clearly we don't have here. But the overall shape or design, if we were, say, looking at a doublet, we would be looking at, start at the neck and work down, what kind of collar does it have? Does it have a collar? How is the neck finished? What style is the collar? The cut of the shape of the shoulders, do they extend beyond the natural shoulder? The sleeves, you've got lots of scope for variety in sleeves. They can be long, they can be short, they can be full, they can be tight-fitting, they can be full at the shoulder and tight-fitting at the wrist, or they can be tight up here and full at the wrist. There's lots of variety there. If you're looking at a garment for the torso, it's like, well, where is the waist? Is it the natural waistline, or is it above? Is it below? Is it higher in the back? Is it pointed in the front? If you were looking at a garment that covers the legs, again, lots of variety of styles. We heard from Pat today, our trunk hose and our nether hose. So you'd be looking at all these overall shapes of the garment when it's complete. Then you look at the cut and construction. So in order to get that shape, how are all the individual parts of the garment cut? The sleeve, is it one piece? Is it two piece? Is the body of the garment, does it have a waist seam? Is it shaped at the waist? How have they accomplished all of that? So then what comes next? Construction, you're looking at where the seams are, how they're sewn, fastenings, decoration. Again, are you applying, beyond the decoration of the fabric before it's cut into a garment, you can have the decoration afterwards, you're sewing on woven laces, or you're embroidering the garment after it's, or during part of the construction. And then you can also look at workmanship and how well a garment is made, how finely is it stitched, how is it shaped. Of course, we don't have the surviving bodies that it went on, so it's very difficult to judge how well did this garment fit, but you can certainly make judgments about tailoring or dressmaking practices that would allow for a very fine fit. So, right, and you go through all those steps, and so what we have here, you can see, if I show you, perhaps, okay, so we've got seams here, we've got one piece of fabric going from sort of this edge around to this edge, and then in the center, we've got two triangular, can you see that one triangular piece of linen there, and another triangular piece of linen there. And let me just see, if you can find a selvage, that's always helpful, but again, if it's not falling apart enough, you won't see. And you all know what I mean by selvage, don't you? Yeah. Good. So, after all that whittering on, what are we looking at? Well, I have to say, I've never seen anything like this before. We certainly don't have one in our collections. I'm not aware of any other collections having something like this, but that just may be my ignorance. Let's just take a measurement here. So, of course, difficult to measure because it's a bit like an accordion. Okay, so 65 centimeters. So for those who like to use the historical measurements because we're that old, 25.5 inches in length, approximately. Every measurement for a garment has approximately beside it, because textiles are inherently stretchy. So, at its narrowest part, it is about sort of 8, not quite 8.25, just 20.5 centimeters. And around here is about 22.5 inches or 57 centimeters. And apart from this sort of tubular accordion shape, and I should note that there are 14 of these circular reinforcements of increasing or decreasing size so that it collapses just inside themselves. And as you can see, there's an opening. Can you see? Sorry. I should be playing to the phone and not to the audience. You can see that this end is hemmed around the end and then up the side as if there were an opening of about 3 inches or 7 centimeters, and it looks like it's come unstitched. So originally it was stitched right up to here and it's come undone. And then at the other end, we can see it's bound. Can you see that? They've taken a narrow strip of linen and just bound the end there. And there's a little bit of gathering just in one area here. You know, just really tiny tucks and not taken with any precision in terms of the space between them. And I can't tell whether that was intended to be open or it's just come unpicked. So perhaps that's just come unstitched right there.
North.
Yep.
I'm aware of the time.
Oh, right, yeah, you want me to say what this
Thank
is?
you for your observations, but I must push you for your
Yeah,
thoughts.
okay, well, I think it's, what else could it be? It looks to me like a sleeve reinforcement. If you're to take like a farthingale and put one on a sleeve, and if you think of those 1590s very full sleeves that you see in portraits, which are very full at the shoulder and narrow at the wrist, that would give you that shape. Very interesting, because I think those of us who've looked at those portraits have always assumed that that was done with padding or quilting. That's my best guess.